Good afternoon. I like the response. So those are my direct service people in the room, right? You get a good response. I'm Krista Larson. I'm the director of the Center on Youth Justice here at the Vera Institute of Justice, and I want to thank all of you for braving the weather, except for those of you online who were not brave and did not come down here, for joining us today for our event on identifying, engaging, and empowering families, a charge for juvenile justice and Georgetown. So we're, as I said, very excited that everyone's here. We're really looking forward to an engaging afternoon. I hope you all got something to eat in the front, and we're going to kick this off. So before we get started, a couple of just housekeeping issues. So we are live streaming, as I mentioned, so behave yourselves in case you don't want your bosses to be able to download this later and use it in your personnel review. But so what that means is that even though we're a pretty tight group here in this room isn't that big, we need to use microphones. So later with questions, somebody will run around with a microphone, and that's really what it's about. It's for the people who are listening in online. Cell phones, this is not the movie theater, but we will hope that you'll put them on silent. But if you have to take a call for some reason, there's a couple of rooms across the way that you can just duck into, because although we hope all of our Vera colleagues are live streaming this at their desks, they may actually also be doing other work. And so if you need to duck into a room across the hall, those are reserved for the afternoon for that purpose. Our bathrooms, the men's room, they luck out today. It's right here, just down the hall on the right. There's also a unisex bathroom there. The ladies' room is, as one guest to Vera once described it to me, a country mile all the way around the other side of the U. Many of you have been here before. You know where that is. And with that, I think we can get started. So I have the privilege of introducing Shay Bilchik, who's joining us today from Georgetown. He's the director of the Center on Juvenile Justice Reform, has many years of experience, and he's going to lead us into this afternoon.
So we have these really neat microphones. Whoever designed this should win an award for a fashion statement, don't you think? I love it. It's great to be here. Thanks, Krista. We are delighted to release this paper today. This has been a long time in coming. I think the first conversation I had with Ryan about the paper probably was about 1.5 years ago. And we were completing one of our certificate programs at Georgetown. And I was talking to Ryan about the way the work around family engagement has been evolving in juvenile justice and child welfare in multiple systems, and how that work was unfolding in the field. And indeed, there's been tremendous progress and a lot of work being done in a variety of agencies and jurisdictions all over the country. But we also recognize the fact that there needed to be a continuing light shown on this issue. That it wasn't that, hey, we've really raised up the issue of family engagement, we're in a better place, so now let's move on to the next issue. So we developed the idea of writing a paper, commissioning a paper, and Ryan and Margaret ended up being the authors of that paper, to focus in more narrowly on juvenile justice related issues. But I think a lot of what this paper reflects is applicable to those other multiple systems. So we're delighted to work with Vera once again. We have multiple projects that we engage in, and Margaret and Ryan have both been part of our certificate program series, predominantly around that family engagement issue. So the way we've organized the afternoon is to have Ryan and Margaret present the paper. They'll spend about 45 minutes or so doing that, and then we'll have about 45 minutes to engage with the audience in a discussion around the contents of the paper. Take a little bit of a break, and then we will move to a panel. And we've constituted the panel in a way that we think will provide, again, a variety of perspectives that are important in terms of where we are with this work, where we've been with this work, and where we need to go with this body of work. So I'm really, really thrilled, and I'll get a chance to introduce the panel later. I want to pause, though, before I introduce Ryan and Margaret and just talk a little bit more about this body of work around family engagement. And I think that in my career lens, and then, of course, in the literature, what we know about this kind of work, there's been an evolution. There really has been an evolution in the way we view and the way we engage families. So I can go back in my own personal experiences in my career. I'm a lawyer by training. I was a prosecutor in Florida. That career started in 1977. and we generally viewed the families as the problem. So it was all about the child, whether it was on the child welfare side, when we looked at the family potentially as the person who neglected or abused a child, whether it be on the juvenile justice side, that what did the family do wrong, that this child ended up in the juvenile justice system, is there bad parenting going on here? We certainly didn't look at family as from a strength-based perspective. It was deficit-based, and we didn't look at family as part of the solution. So I believe in terms of the body of work we're talking about, that the good work that really started happening was in the mental health arena with systems of care. And if I go back to that body of work in the mid-1980s, when they were really moving more towards a family-centered, strength-based perspective, it was that system that lifted up and said, we need to look and view families differently, and we need to engage them differently, and we need to think more of families as partners, not as the target or object of our work. And then that work moved forward, and SAMHSA, the federal department, really took it and ran with it, multiple demonstration sites around the country, and I think that that generally is considered, maybe not perfect, but a very strong body of work that is taking place around family engagement. So I want to move a little bit in these systems, because I think when I think about family engagement, I think about 4 systems. I think about that systems of care work in behavioral health and mental health. I think about child welfare and where child welfare has been in relation to engaging families. And I think although it is the center of their universe, so to speak, because they work with families, that is why they exist, is to support families, engage families, help to lift up families. I think there's been an evolution in that body of work as well, where often we would find child welfare systems moving forward or operating from a deficit basis, not from a strength-based perspective. And I think now that work has shifted 180 degrees, where we've really seen child welfare agencies saying, we will not be successful in engaging and working with these families if we don't look at them as partners in our work. And so I think there's been a tremendous amount of effort made to move child welfare in that direction, which brings me to juvenile justice and education. So I think juvenile justice was really late coming to this party, and I'm not an educational specialist, but I think maybe the invitation in many school districts around the country is still being written to the staff and family members about engaging families differently around educational issues. In many communities, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about education, but in many communities, family engagement is a matter of whether there is a family who comes in prepared and knowledgeable about their rights and can engage effectively, or families who don't, who may not understand what their children are entitled to, and therefore don't necessarily get those services and supports for their kids. Again, a lot of good work has moved forward there. But in juvenile justice, we really didn't, I think, understand the dimension and the importance of family engagement until probably the 1990s, early 2000s, when we started seeing a lot of research come forward. And the research about effective programs and effective practice invariably started to have this family component to it. So when we saw multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy, multidimensional treatment foster care, family teaming models, there was a dimension to the work that we had really neglected, which was, yes, the client is the youth, but in working effectively with that young person, if we ignore the family and don't create the supports for the family to be successful along with the youth, we're not going to end up doing really good work with that family and that child. So when the initial doctrine of parens patriae came forward, where the system serves as a substitute for the parent, juvenile justice was really operating that way in terms of a deficit frame. We take control, we direct you what to do, and not really engaging the families, I think, in a very respectful way. So I think that really has changed significantly in juvenile justice over the past 5 to 10 years in particular. The ironic part about that is that the research that was done around these issues in many ways was research that was prompted by the infusion of money into our juvenile justice systems in the 1990s that was about responding to juvenile crime and this spike in juvenile crime. Little did we know that the derivative benefit of that would be it also sponsored hundreds of millions of dollars of research. And it was that research that really has allowed us to see exactly the efficacy of doing the work in a different way. So in sitting down with Ryan and Margaret and thinking about this white paper and what it might look like, we were delighted to be able to frame the paper around the identification, the engagement, and the empowerment of families. Because if we really think about how we do our work well, it isn't one-dimensional. It isn't that we have a really good teaming model. It's that we're thinking more holistically about who families are, and then how do we more effectively engage them? And then how do we empower families to have a voice stronger than the individual voice, but a stronger collective voice? And we'll hear a lot more about that today as the paper is presented. So with that, let me introduce Ryan and Margaret. Some of you, many of you probably know them. I've had the pleasure of knowing them probably for almost a decade, which has been a delight for me. Ryan is the research director at the Center on Youth Justice here at Vera. She started at Vera in Family Justice program working with juvenile justice agencies, correctional departments, and faith and community-based organizations to support them in adopting family-focused and strength-based approaches. She has been an instructor in several of our certificate programs. Her research interests are at the intersection of the justice system and social identity, specifically race, gender, class, and sexual orientation. She has her BA from the University of Connecticut and her master's and PhD in women's studies from the University of Maryland. So I'm going to introduce Margaret as well, and then they're going to come up one at a time and present the paper. Margaret diZerega is the project director at the Center on Sentencing and Corrections here at Vera. She started with Vera as the Family Justice Program when it moved here from another organization, and preceded by her time as Director of Training and Technical Assistance at that organization, Family Justice, spearheading the development of the Relational Inquiry Tool. She also has been an instructor in a number of our certificate programs at Georgetown, has her BA in American Studies from Williams College and a Master's of Public Administration from NYU's Robert Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. It's been my delight to be able to work with them over the years, and I know you're going to enjoy the presentation of the paper.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm humbled to have you all here and excited about family engagement. If you had talked to Margaret and I 8 years ago when we first started working together about if we could fill a room with people who were excited about talking about families and for kids in the juvenile justice system, we probably wouldn't have expected this. So this is really great. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today, but I'm going to start by immediately breaking the rules Krista has laid out for us. And so I'm going to ask you to do a little call and response without the microphone, but for those who are watching from home or their computer, I promise that I will repeat everything everyone here says. So I just want you to do me a favor and call out who sits around your table at Thanksgiving or your favorite holiday. Who are the people that are there? What are their relationships to you? Mom, brother, children, aunts, sister, cousins, nephews, friends, a grandson, a neighbor, okay, a church member. Thank you. For me, sometimes it's my coworkers. Who are, you know, they cross that line between coworker and friend. So I heard grandson, nephews, aunts, cousins. All of this is the way that you define who you reach out to, who your connections are. And if you are an incarcerated young person, I have to tell you that the vast majority of those people who support you and that you support, you would not be able to be in contact with them at all, right? So if you are a young man in a detention facility, at almost every detention facility across this country, you can't even have the contact with your brothers and sisters. If you're a young woman in a long-term placement facility, so maybe one of those further into the system, those aunts and uncles and cousins, they can't visit unless they jump through a lot of hoops. And forget having any of your friends there helping you through could be one of the hardest times of your life. And so when we named this paper A Charge for Juvenile Justice Agencies, that's exactly what we meant. It is time to change the way we think about family and the way that they are available to support young people who are involved in the juvenile justice system. And what we're going to do today, you will now have the paper, and if you don't, we'll get you a copy, and you can read that at your own leisure. So we're not going to go through the paper, but what we'll do is talk about 3 stories that really bring to life the core concepts of identifying, engaging, and empowering families in the juvenile justice system. We're also going to talk about the challenges that agencies face, right? Where are my system partners here? Who's brave enough to say that they work in the juvenile justice system? Woo! All right, there we go in the back. So there's real challenges there, right? Our workers, they have to hold two things, that they value the importance of family at the same time as they hold anxieties around safety and security, around staffing resources and budget-strapped times, right? So we're going to talk about those real challenges that face them. And then we're going to talk about what Margaret and I want to see out of this paper, you know, what we think the vision for the field is and where we hope this paper will lead folks through a map that we have laid out. We're going to do all of this and still have ample time for a lot of dialogue and discussion. And I think that this paper is going to have you asking lots of questions, and we want to do that. And I should say that every time you hear me say the word family, I want you to think about the broadest definition, that definition that we all just talked about in here. And so we're going to talk about how that is through identification, is that we can get that broadest definition of family. But Margaret's going to first start off by telling us about how we got here and how this paper is one part of a legacy of family work at Vera.
Great, thank you, Ryan. So Shay did a great job of giving us some of the historical context to why family engagement became a much bigger part of the conversation in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we certainly saw that happen here at Vera. So historically, a lot of our family engagement work was actually happening in our demonstration projects. For those of you who may remember Esperanza, Adolescent Portable Therapy, and we'll hear more about APT and its newest incarnation later on the panel, but also La Bodega de la Familia. And that's where Ryan and I sort of started in on this work. So the work that we were doing had some really core values and that carry forward today, the one being certainly strength-based, as Shay mentioned, and identifying the strengths and resources within families and social supports, and sort of carrying that into our work now with government. So who here has ever drawn a family tree, or maybe has the genealogist in the family who created all those family trees? My grandmother was a state historian in Kansas for a while, so you can imagine we have our tree many times drawn. And it didn't look quite like this, though she certainly could have done a genogram. And we use these kinds of family maps like a genogram to just remind us what's different when we take that kind of individual lens with the young person versus the family lens. So with the individual lens, we may look at, Ray as the person who's come into our office or who's on probation or who's in court proceedings, and think about, Ray and what interests he has, what goals he has, how we can help him within our office, or what referrals we can offer. If we zoom out and look at the family lens, we can think about who's in Ray's family, who's around his Thanksgiving table, and what are some of the intergenerational challenges in Ray's family. So the sort of bluish color indicates justice system involvement. The hashed lines indicate mental illness. But also, what are the intergenerational strengths that we see in Ray's family? So if he's working on a college application or getting ready for an interview or a resume, who in his family could help him with those goals? So that's just, I always sort of think about the genogram as an example of how the family-focused approach gives us access to a broader array of resources and supports. Okay. So the first part of our framework, as Ryan mentioned, is really around identifying families. And the project that really kind of brings us home for me is our work with Ohio's Department of Youth Services. It started in 2010, and that's their state-level Juvenile Justice Agency. So we were there for our first site visit. We're very excited. And one of the first things we got to observe was a graduation ceremony for children whose parole had been revoked. They had a special unit, intensive case management services, higher staff to youth ratio, it seemed, than other parts of the facility. And so we saw them all graduate. There were tears. It was great. And then we talked to one of the women after the graduation about, what was different about these young people and how were they prepared to go back home. And she knew that we were there to talk about family and social support. So she looked over all of their plans for their return to the community. And she was really concerned because not one of their plans mentioned anything about who was going to help them reach their goals, who would they call if they were struggling with sobriety. It was all about, what they were going to do on their own, and hopefully with the help and support of their parole officer. But there was nothing about those natural strengths. Very different from if, the young person had a genogram like Ray and could build those social supports in from the beginning. So one of the things we did early on in our work with Ohio, we were there it was ended up being a 3-year engagement, and we were really brought in to help them think about policies and practices that could help staff tap into youth social support. They were the first state to implement the Juvenile Relational Inquiry tool, which I'll explain in a little bit. But one of the first things we did was try to get a sense of what's the extent that youth are having contact with their families now. And one of the things we wanted to look at was any kind of connection between visitation frequency and behavioral incidents that youth were having on the unit. So the average at the time behavioral incidents per month was around 8. So this may not surprise those of you who are here, but the people who are getting more regular visits on the far right box there, were having half the number of behavioral incidents a month, and those who are never getting visits were having way more behavioral incidents per month. So there's clearly something more to family contact than just thinking about the benefits for sort of the post-release reentry period, but also really about facility safety, staff safety, and youth progress while in the facilities. This is the state of Ohio, if you are familiar with it. And that sort of red star at the top is where one of the facilities is located, and it's near the city of Cleveland. And so we wanted to get a sense of, depending on how close the families are to the facility, how was that impacting visitation? So we saw, and at the time, the average length of stay for youth was 17 months. So in the course of 17 months, depending on your family's proximity to the facility, you may never get a visit. So the people in that bottom part of the state in School District 10, those youth were not getting visits during their time in the facility. And, if you think about much larger states, California, New York, other places, you could imagine that this phenomenon would only get exacerbated. So one of the things we started to do in Ohio was to think about, how could we really help staff ask youth about their family and social support and engage with those family members. And one way that we wanted to help staff identify who was in the youth family and social support was through the Juvenile Relational Inquiry tool. It's a sort of a script, takes the staff about 15 minutes to complete, and really ask questions to get at that broader definition of family. Because what we learned and what we heard from staff in the facilities was that when they asked youth about family, they would get answers around sort of more biological family members. But when you start asking things like, who supports you? Who's helping you reach your goals while you're here? You might get different kinds of questions or different kinds of answers. I remember a youth specialist talking about, he liked to ask youth, who would they watch the favorite basketball team? Like who would they watch the game with? Or who would they call to rub it in when their team won and the other guy's team lost? So thinking about other ways to learn about who's in that youth social support network. And in Ohio, the youth really felt that the youth specialists, who used to be called corrections officers, that they were the ones who should be using this tool because they're the ones who spend the most time with the youth on the unit as opposed to the social workers or other more specialized staff who they saw less frequently. So the way it got implemented was that the youth specialists were the ones administering the JRIT. Youth were assigned parole officers early in their time at the facility. So the parole officers had ongoing relationships with the family throughout the youth placement. So the youth specialists were sharing that information about who was in that family support with the parole officers. And then there were conversations happening in the facility and outside about, who in that social network was able to maintain contact with the family. But, as I mentioned earlier, visitation was a real challenge given distance. So one of the things that the staff in Ohio were working on were to identify other ways that families could stay connected despite the distance. For example, involving families in treatment team meetings. So these were the weekly meetings about the youth progress on the facility. And you know, initially it was sort of like, well, how could we get families there? Well, maybe we could get them on the phone. Well, our phones aren't in the meeting rooms. Well, what if we get an extension cord? So seemingly simple fixes like an extension cord, you know, to bring the phone in the room and really make it easier for the families to participate in those conversations when they weren't able to be there in person. They made modifications to their visit policy, including siblings, things like inviting families to come to, you know, the worship ceremonies they had, come to sporting events. They started working with their child welfare equivalent agency and thinking about how they could share costs to bring in the family finding technology. Is that familiar to anyone here? Family finding? So the idea with family finding is you can take some amount of information about family, you know, last names, date of birth, that sort of thing, access various databases that exist, and identify a number of additional family members who might be known, who might not have been known to the young person. And one of the other things that they did, so in our initial survey of the young people in the facilities, we were asking them how many were themselves parents. And this was not information they had previously collected. And so we were also asking those parents, how many of you have seen your children while you've been here? Not surprisingly, the number was pretty low. And to the surprise of the facility, there were a fair number of parents in the facility who were young parents. So they brought in this Baby Elmo parenting program. And this picture is of a sort of special visit room for the Baby Elmo program participants. And the idea is to create a parenting program that's run by facility staff where they're teaching parenting skills to, you know, very new parents. You know, how to put on a diaper, how to take the baby's temperature, things that I certainly benefited from when I took my How to Be a Mom class. And one of the things that was really stunning to us, you know, we got some feedback from some of the young people in the program, and one father commented that his daughter was born after he had already been in a facility for 2 months. So he wasn't there for her birth. He was only able to see her the last Saturday of every month for an hour. And, you know, she's a new baby, so by the time the hour was up, she'd finally warmed up and it was off, you know, time for her to leave. And with this program, he saw her every week. She knew who he was, he knew who she was, and, you know, it really laid a good foundation for them to continue their parental relationship once he was back into the community. So those are some of the different changes that we saw in Ohio around both identifying family and social support using that broader definition, and then also around engagement. So I'm going to turn it back to Ryan, who's going to give you some more on the engagement side.
Thank you, Margaret. So one of the, there we go, key takeaways that we had from our work in Ohio was that there were really simple ways to identify a broader range of families that could be very easily replicated across the United States and other jurisdictions. And so that was a great way to figure out how we could take doing in Ohio and expand it. But we also learned something else, and it might seem a little bit boring at first, but I promise if you stick with me, you'll be impressed at the end. So we learned that agencies had no systems to track data on family engagement practices. And what we believed was that because they didn't track family engagement practices, it actually made it harder for them to engage family. So why would I think that data tracking would be connected to them being able to get families involved, more families involved more often? Well, I think two things. The first is that I feel like, or I had a hunch that states just didn't know what they did. They didn't know what their practices were. So for an example with Margaret in Ohio that she gave you, that they didn't know who was fathers. But two, they didn't know that even the things that they did, whether or not that was successful at creating change. So her example about the treatment team, if you decide to invite family members to a treatment team meeting, but you don't track whether or not they show up, you don't know if you've affected any change by extending that invitation. So what we did was we partnered with an organization that had a strong track record for using data to affect change. And the Performance-Based Standards Learning Institute, which is a very long name, but they go by PBS, not to be confused with Public Broadcasting Systems, is a national nonprofit that works, please come in. I'm sorry to embarrass you, but there is at least one seat right there. We're all family, folks. We're all family. So Performance-Based Standards is a national nonprofit that uses data to track change. And this is not a political map, even though it is blue and red. But the blue are actually just the states that are using PBS to track their data. And the red states are folks that came online this year. Sorry, one more time. Is this seat taken? Yes. Does anyone have an empty seat next to them? No? Margaret, do you have an empty seat next to you? You do. Come on over, guys. So, all right. And we're back. Okay, so the red line states are places that came on this year. And what this means to me is that this is a growing movement, right? They're in the majority of states. States understand that this is important to track. But where did PBS come from and what do they do? They started because people were really concerned about conditions of confinement. So they started to track data that would make sense if you were concerned about conditions of confinement. So they looked at things like security and safety, and that might even include things very basic, like the number of fire extinguishers inside a long-term placement facility. And then they also track things like access to services, so mental health services, education. And they do this twice a year. So they have facilities reporting out to them on their data every 6 months, and then they get reports back about what they've given to PBS. And those reports do a couple of things. They help facilities measure success over time. So they allow them to create goals that they want to meet around these standards of mental health care or standards of education, number of hours a kid spends in room confinement or isolation, right? You want to track that, see how long, if you're getting better and making a goal. But it also allows you to compare yourself to other like-sized facilities around the country that are also reporting this data. So we said to PBS, what could it look like if we put family at the same equal importance and stature as safety and security? And we had facilities starting to measure how they're doing here. And what would that look like? And could it impact change? Could it trigger a change in facilities? We're going to get to the answer to that last question in just a second, but I'll tell you the good news is that PBS was like, that sounds interesting, well, let's do this. And so we got some funding from Public Welfare Foundation, a private foundation, to really develop these standards. And they had us bring together a range of experts from around the field. We had family advocates at the table. We had formerly incarcerated people at the table. We had system actors, so people who work day-to-day inside long-term placement facilities and leadership of juvenile justice agencies. We also had other experts in the field, like our very own Shay Bilchik. And these folks got together, and I wish I could tell you that we were like doing rocket science and that we made amazing, crazy standards to try to drag the field forward. But what we realized is that to raise the bar of juvenile justice, you did not have to go very high. So this is just one example of the blueprint that we developed for the field. And I want to draw your attention to the first one, which is just that, do you know who the family is? And how are you bringing them into any decisions you are making about this kid? And I want to remind people that we are talking about the vast majority of kids we're talking about are under 18 years old. And at the most, they're college-age kids. So these are people that should have, at minimum, parent involvement in the decisions that are being made about the therapist they see, the type of therapy they get, the schooling they take, and the recreational programs that they get involved in to supplement all of that other good work that's happening in facilities. And we had to create a standard to just tell juvenile justice agencies, just make sure you know who the family is, and you should maybe involve them and invite them to participate. So it gets even better, because that group of experts did some very hardcore scientific methods of figuring out how do you get to that standard. And we did things like, and Margaret will love this one, we said, does the youth have any children? Could you just ask if the kids have kids? And if yes, then how often has that child seen his kid in the entirety of his stay here? So what we heard in Ohio is that that could be 17 months, right? How many parents do I have in the room? I am the owner of a 16-year-old cat. And so my experience is not as great as yours. But that first 17 months of a baby's life, how impactful is it about the bond, right? We all took the human development in college or in high school. We know that this is really important. And so this was the very, to me, I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to belittle how hard agencies work, right? I do not in any way, shape, or form that this was the reflection of malicious staff across the country that was like, keep these moms and dads away from their little newborn babies. I don't think that that's what it was. I think it was good, well-intentioned people who were doing what they were trained to do, who were doing things the way they had always been done and had never questioned that process. And, you know, I think so we started to, you know, see that we could collect this data, and even PBS was in some ways constrained in our process, PBS being the agency that had been doing this, because they collected data a very specific way. And so they said, okay, we're going to collect data. We're going to ask folks to get their youth record and to get surveys from young people and from staff. And we said, if you're going to do this work and you're going to do it well, you have to hear from the people most impacted. You have to survey families. And that was just like, and it's not because they didn't think that families had a voice in this, but they were like, oh, the logistics of that, you know, youth, they're right there. You just ask them to fill out a form. The staff have to come into work. You ask them to fill out a 15-minute survey. But how are we going to do this with families? But we made it happen. So we called again on those experts from around the field, including Shay, Margaret, myself, Krista was even a part of this, and we developed we took surveys that we used in Ohio to learn from families, and we incorporated that, and we forced facilities to start asking questions of their family members. And those questions ranged from very practical things like, how long does it take you to get to the facility and how much do you spend on gas? To other less tangible items, like whether or not you felt welcomed in the facility, or if you felt respected, or if you were invited to events. Right? There are so many methods and ways that detention and long-term placement facilities tell families, we got this, you're not welcomed. And it starts at the front door when families are searched. Margaret and I have worked in agencies where babies' diapers are searched through before they're able to visit with, their family member. Family members having to do this at the front door after going through a metal detector, after getting patted down. I mean, I go through TSA like 4 times a month. I don't even have to do that, right? So these were all examples of not feeling respected and welcomed at a facility. We also have great examples of facilities who decided, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to put the onus of safety and security on young people, and we'll search young people after a visit, and we'll do a sweep for contraband after a visit. But families were able to just go through a quick metal detector, just like you're at the airport, and keep it moving, and have that time with your loved one. And that message is so clear about who values that they want these parents in there, they want them involved, and who's wary of these parents and thinks that they're a threat or a danger. So in those surveys, we got really amazing content, and we got a lot of good information. And so we said, all right, well, we gotta pilot this somewhere. And so we did one version of the pilot in Ohio, but we've been working in Ohio for a while, so they were hip to our game. Like Margaret said, people started to get prepared when they knew we were coming to visit. They knew that we were there to talk about family. So we decided to do it in another state as well to compare it, and we chose Indiana. And this is a very New York City-centric office, so I thought it would be important for me to tell you where Indiana is. Margaret told me yesterday that on a Bachelor show, they that the kids watch these days, that they had a quiz of figuring out where Indiana was on the map. So I was like, I will also do that because Indiana's not easy to place. I thought it was much further in the middle. So they asked Indiana to pilot the family survey and then the standard questions around how many times are families involved in treatment team meetings, collecting that rote data. Indiana inputted their data the first 6-month cycle. When they got that report back, they were appalled and shocked. And it was a call to action. And without any technical assistance from us, but we're very good, just so you know, but without us, they decided to increase their numbers, and they decided to be very ambitious and say, we're going to increase our numbers in 6 months. We want to see some changes in 6 months. And so they started to do a lot of different things. They wanted to make sure that families were in contact, informed, and engaged throughout the process of a young person's time with them. And they started with their visitation cycle. And I always joked when I first saw the Indiana visitation policy, I said it would have been easier for me to figure out when to visit my kid if it was by the moon cycle. Like, it was just so complicated. You had to have, it was the first initial of your last name was on this AM on Saturday, but PM on Sunday, and then it switched the week after, and God help you if there was 5 weeks in a month, like it was just so confusing. And you were only allowed to visit once a week. So if you could come Saturday AM, and Sunday PM, you were out of luck. You only got 1 visit for 2 hours. And this was a place that the average length of stay at this time was around 9 to 12 months. So you might be able to see your kid once a week. And they changed that dramatically and overnight to say you can come visit your kid as many times as you want, whenever you want, as long as they're not in school. I want that to sink in for a minute, because I cannot tell you how crazy that is, right? Like how radically different this is than the vast majority of states around the country. That you can visit your kid whenever you want. When do you want to come? You tell us when you want to come visit. That is very different than being given a packet, an orientation packet that says you can come on Wednesdays from 6 to 7 and on Saturdays or Sundays between the hours of 9 and 3, right? So you have to just wrap yourself like a pretzel around those policies. So this was really great in Indiana. They also decided to innovate. They had a video visitation program going, and this was a few years ago when everyone was like, oh, the cool thing is to do video visitation, awesome. But most places, parents had to drive to a parole office, right? And they had to sit in a sterile parole office and look into a computer and have that visit with their family member. And they innovated, and they said, you know what, we're going to do a platform that allows families to do this from the comfort of their own home or their mobile phone. Right? So think about that. You've been locked up for 11 months and you're seeing your living room for the first time. Or you're seeing your family pet. Right? Like, I have a 16-year-old cat. No one told me cats lived that long when I found that child. But to be able to see him, that would be amazing, right? That would be very motivating for me to get home. Right? It's so easy for kids to just pretend that doesn't exist anymore and just try to put their nose down and deal with what they have to deal with. And so this is a really great way to remind kids, to connect them back, and to motivate them to go home. They also started having youth-led facility tours for families so that they could see what happened here, right? So often this curtain goes up, your kid is led out the back of a court room, you show up at a facility and you have no idea what happens behind that locked door. And so they were drawing the curtain back, breaking down the wall between community and facility. And that does a lot of things. So as a parent, that's going to ease my anxiety about what my kid what's happening to my kid. It's also going to put more eyes on people. Why don't you want family members back there seeing what's going on and how staff are interacting even down a hallway, right? So this is really important. And they started informing parents. They had open houses for school more often so that it could be more natural and be more similar to the the public school system in the community. And they also developed, and they weren't the first state to do this, but they replicated Texas's Parents' Bill of Rights that said you have the right to know what's going on with your son or daughter or loved one. And you have the right to be informed in that decision-making process. Similar to what Shay was talking about, that other fields have done way before juvenile justice. Okay, so the Indiana, I told you that would be exciting towards the end. They, within 6 months, were able to double their visitation rates. These are not, let me clarify any suspicion that Indiana dropped all their old bad kids and bad families and got a new set of new kids with new awesome, well-functioning, put-together families. These are the same families that we're talking about. And so when you hear from other people in the field that these families or those families are disempowered, they're disengaged, they got too much going on, they've given up on their kids, don't believe them, because all it took was changing some policies and practices to see a difference in visitation rates. So those same families that just didn't want to visit their kids, all of a sudden, when you tell them they can come whenever they can make it, they're showing up. And we're happy to report that that was just in the first 6 months, visitation rates doubled. They have seen ridiculous amounts of visitation over the last year, 2 years that this has now been up. And, we're seeing rates of like 200% increases in visitation for kids. I mean, this is just remarkable. We haven't seen any other changes like that or been able to track it, and that's what's important. I think someone, told me that you only track what you think is important, right? And so telling staff that they have to track data can actually help you engage families in the process of their loved one being in the system. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about empowering families. So Margaret and I talked to you about 2 state systems for empowering families. I'm going to shift a little bit and talk to you about county level juvenile justice work. And this project is just starting. So I don't have as much information for you, but tune back in. You might see something on the Vera website in about a year and a half. But why I want to talk about this is because juvenile justice, we've done a great job of reducing the number of kids in our system. And so I really believe that juvenile justice is more local than it has ever been before. And so thinking about how detention facilities, which Margaret and I have been in a lot of detention facilities, they are like maximum security adult prisons. It's amazing. We were in one detention facility where kids were not allowed to make eye contact with anyone while they walked in a hallway. They were not allowed to speak during any meals unless it was to a staff member, right? So because detention is dealing with kids that are at varying levels of risk, they take these very extreme measures, and that backs up to the amount of contact that families can have and the amount of engagement that families have in their school and in their mental health processing, and also about empowering. And so in Sedgwick County, Kansas, I didn't put up a map there, but it's close to Indiana, right? No. Okay, so I did not get a PhD in geography, people. So Sedgwick County, Kansas has decided that they got their numbers to a good place. They feel like their youth are safe. And they've decided to create an entire model for county-wide juvenile justice reform that is centered and organized around family, so that they want to empower families to be involved in the process from the minute the kid's arrested, and then unfortunately, if they get through the court system and they decide to get placed in a short-term detention facility, they want all of those people using the same language and the same approach, from the probation officer and the aftercare worker to the correctional officer in the detention facility to the group worker, the young, just graduated from college group worker in a group home in that county. They want everyone on the same page. And this is a really exciting work. And one of the things that I want to draw your attention to, we just did our family focus groups and family surveys, which are always some of my favorite parts of a project, not the least of which, because you get to like sit down and have dinner with some family members during the focus groups. Always feed families and focus groups, folks, always. We fed y'all, you loved it. So family councils, I want to draw your attention to that, because what is interesting about Sedgwick County, and they have a few models at the larger long-term placement facilities, is about sharing power. So giving up some of your power and allowing family members to organize themselves so that you're not involved. And so we're working with Kansas to figure out if a community-based organization would be better suited to help organize the family council than it's coming from DJJ. And that's a tough balance, right? Because they're trying to figure out, we want to make sure families know that this is like supported by us and that we're going to listen and that we endorse this, but having it rooted in a community-based organization might help with its sustainability and with the recruitment process, because for so many years, families have had bad experiences with the Department of Corrections, their cousins have been through it, maybe an older sibling has been through it, maybe they've been through it themselves, and it wasn't a great experience. So just telling them that things are different now doesn't always work. You got to show up and prove that things are different. But the idea of the family council is that you get parents and family members broadly defined to include the cousins we talked about at the Thanksgiving table, or, you know, the mom's girlfriend or wife to be able to be involved. And that family council will be able to respond and react to decisions that are being made about policies and practices. They might even be able to help develop things like the Parent Bill of Rights. Let them write that Parent Bill of Rights and have the DJJ or DOC react to it. So this is a really exciting project. And again, we've just started. It's a 1.5-year project, so we'll have more results, and we're tracking data with this one. So you'll get some of that in about 1.5 years. So keep an eye out for that. So we've done a great job of talking, we've done a great job. Translate. Identifying, engaging, and empowering families. We are now going to talk about the charge that we are giving to juvenile justice agencies to do better in this area. And so Margaret's going to talk about the challenges that agencies are facing when we're asking them to do better.
Thanks, Ryan. And you did do a great job. So I think, you know, we've certainly seen over the course of the time that we've been here, and, you know, as Shay outlined some of the time before that, how the field is sort of shifting. And so you may be wondering, well, why are we even having this conversation? Because so much progress has been made, and that is true, and we are strength-based, so we need to recognize that. But I think, you know, depending on the state that a young person is in or that a family is dealing with, that they may not be seeing some of those same benefits that Ryan described in Indiana, or that we've seen in Ohio, or what's to come in Sedgwick County, Kansas. So, you know, thinking just about identifying family members, how many states allow visitors beyond immediate family to come into the facility? Based on a scan that we did of national policy, there are only 10 states that use a broad definition of family for visits. So other family members may be able to get in through the doors through some sort of special arrangements, but just for business as usual, it's really only 10 states. And we'll hear later on in the panel how this can really impact folks who are in the system. As far as engaging, you know, how many facilities are involving families in the case management processes, figuring out if they need to get that extension cord, or, you know, there are states that have buses come from big cities to bring families in to visit. You know, how many states are doing those kinds of things? So our answer would be not enough. And we'll hear a little bit in the panel later today about how the state of Virginia is headed in this direction, to make sure that families are involved at every step in the way of their young person's progress. And, you know, I think the last piece around empowering is, you know, a lot of places aren't going to be there yet because they haven't yet done the identifying and engaging. But, you know, one could argue you could start with empowering and the other two are going to take care of themselves. So thinking about, you know, how many agencies out there are really partnering with family-led organizations and sharing power with families. And we have a great colleague who's joining us this afternoon who's going to be talking about a fantastic organization that's really led by and is for families who have young people in the juvenile justice system and the important role that they can play in system reform. And I'm going to turn it back to Ryan for our final piece. and then we will get into some dialogue. So for all of you out there remotely, you are welcome to use the chat box to raise any questions, and we will get back to you.
Great, thank you. So just very quickly, because we're almost right at time, but what are those future directions that we want to see? It was not an accident that we titled this A Charge to Juvenile Justice Agencies. I truly believe that it is the responsibility, just as much as safety and security, of juvenile justice agencies to involve family members and to keep kids connected to those in the community that support them. And for people in the audience, or probably not y'all because you came here in the rain, so you already are bought into this, but for your coworkers who say, yeah, but what about that kid who's got nobody? I would tell you that it is your responsibility to find that kid somebody, right? It is your responsibility to find that kid somebody, to connect that kid to somebody, and to make sure that that somebody is committed to ensuring that that kid is successful and go home. Everything we talked about today, all of the challenges that we see are in the face of research that has shown time and time again that kids who have family contact do better. They do better in school, they do better, they have fewer behavior incidences, which we found in Ohio, and they have better outcomes. And there's some research that even shows that kids who have a family-focused approach in their juvenile justice system, it reduces the chance that their siblings ever get involved in the juvenile justice system. There's also research that shows that even when that parent and kid might not have the most positive relationship, that family contact serves as a protective factor no matter what, and those kids are recidivating at lower rates. So it is really, we know that this data exists. We know that this is a key to success for young people and to keep our community safe. And yet we have built up an entire system whose policies completely restrict all of that diverse support and connection for kids. And so it's our charge that this white paper, be a roadmap for facilities to really start thinking and reflecting about their practices. Our hope is that agencies will take this to the next staff meeting and say, what could we do differently? If things were to change, what would it look like? If we had all the money in the world, what could we do differently to get more families involved more often? And we ask those questions a lot of times when we're providing TA, and it's amazing because you get staff to think really outside the box, but none of it requires a lot of money, right? So you can find within your own resources ways to get more families involved for better outcomes for youth. So with that, I'm going to end there, and I'm going to turn it over to Shay, and we're going to come sit over here. Look how confident I am in that response.
So please join me in a round of applause for our authors. So I'm going to kick us off with a question for them, but we have microphones, I think. We have a microphone in the back. So we'll be able to entertain questions from the audience as well. And somehow, somewhere on the screen, when it stops says future directions, there'll be something popping up and telling me if there's a question from the audience, right? Okay. So I think the word power and the differential in power was mentioned during the presentation. And I would love for you to talk more about that, because I think one of the issues that we see constantly when we talk to family members is that they still don't feel that there's this level playing field. They feel that if they really say what's on their mind, that somehow either they or their child, so I'm thinking cross systems here, they in the child welfare system or their child in the juvenile justice system would pay the price for that honesty and that transparency. How do you see that unfolding? And because it cross-cuts into the differential in power and then building the trust that this platform that they're saying exists actually will play out in a way that doesn't hurt my family. Any thoughts about that?
So I think it's a really important question, and I think that trust is really important. So often we will go to an agency and they'll be like, but we had a family night and there was pizza. And no one showed up. We bought pizza. And it's like, well, you have not created an atmosphere of trust wherein the families want to get there and want to interact with you, or that they believe that if they interact with you and they talk openly, that is going to be received well and that it's not going to blow back on them. So part of what we did when Washington, D.C. was a state that, not a state, was an agency, a system that we worked with, and we did two things. We did hold focus groups that then led to a family council, but those family focus groups were organized by Justice for Families, which is a nonprofit that Margaret hinted at and that you'll get to meet later today, this afternoon. And Justice for Families is run for and by family members who have a loved one in the justice system. So having them engage and having the Department of Juvenile Justice step out and say, we're going to give you this time, was the first step that that organization took to rebuild the trust that they had torn down with families. And let me be clear that the trust component of this falls squarely on systems. This is not on family members. And so it's a requirement of the system to do something differently to regain that trust. The second thing that they did was that they hired a family advocate as a part of their team who had a child with system involvement. And that is another message that says, okay, well, if you don't feel comfortable talking at a treatment team meeting, maybe you'll feel comfortable talking to me. My kid went through this same system, or my kid went through a similar system. And then maybe I come with you to that treatment team meeting, or maybe I have a conversation with that treatment team meeting about how they facilitate that meeting so that family feels welcome, right? So maybe it's about they get to speak first. So it's it doesn't have to be huge steps, but these baby steps can really make huge inroads into balancing that power. I think also developing those family councils and saying this visitation policy was responded to and reacted to by family members who are most impacted by the system. They helped us write this visitation policy, and they helped us brainstorm the problems that we thought were going to exist when we changed visitation policies. And they helped us think through solutions to meeting those problems around staffing, safety and security, how the visitation schedule could conflict with education or programming, right? Families can help you brainstorm that. And so bringing them in will start that process. But I don't think it's easy, and I don't think it happens overnight. And I get really frustrated with agencies' frustration that they changed one thing and they expect parents to flood the gates for the free pizza. It's not going to happen.
Margaret, anything to add? Anything from the audience on that issue? Because I saw a lot of heads nodding as Ryan was speaking. I'm curious about your perspective on this. I have some additional thoughts I want to share, but want to start getting you engaged in the conversation as well. Any thoughts about this trust issue and how you begin to break it down? There was a judge in Ohio. That's that state that Ryan identified on the map for you. By the way, there's Indiana, I think then there's Illinois, and then I think there might be Missouri, maybe then there's Iowa, and then we get to Kansas, you know. But the judge was showing me his courtroom, and he was trying to show me the technology that he was using. This is the presiding judge in a large county in Ohio. Not the largest county, but you're not going to figure it out from what I'm telling you. And when he was showing me the technology, it was kind of a neat thing. Everything was now taped. There was no court reporter taking notes, so everything was digitalized. And I was waiting for us to hold a meeting about the project we were working on, so I was getting a little impatient. And he finally looked at me and says, "Do you understand what I do with this?" And I said, "You record the proceedings, and then eventually someone could put digital, 2:05 p.m. on Tuesday, and you get to listen to it." And he goes, "Exactly, but you have no idea what I actually do with it." I listen to these tapes at night. I listen to the tapes of my fellow judges and my magistrates and how they talk to the families and how they talk to the young people. Because ultimately, if we're going to build trust, it's going to be that we engage young people and families differently. So he made a very specific point. I don't control who gets elected as judges in my circuit. They're assigned to the family court. I supervise them, but they run their own court. But it makes a difference if I take the time to call them in and say, I was listening to the Jones family or the Smith family, and I was listening to the way you were talking to the family members, and you were talking down to them. You're not going to build trust if you denigrate them in some way. You need to change the way you engage from the bench. And then he turned to me and said, and by the way, we then also need to make sure our agencies change the way they engage. So the family's experience from the very beginning into the court process feels a lot different. So I guess my lesson from that was, one, that technology can be used in some very creative ways, but two, that it is ultimately about case practice. It's about having a workforce that understands better how to enter a conversation with a family in a way that doesn't disempower them, that doesn't make them feel that they are considered to be the problem, but are considered to be the experts on their family moving forward. I don't know if there's any reaction to that from the group here today, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts about how this translates to case practice. If you could just identify yourself. I got one back here, and then we'll come back up.
Sure. Barbara Nuehi, Boys Town. In terms of case practice, I think our agency, even in changing how we speak, sometimes we speak a lot Boys Townian, and speak agency-wise, a lot of the lingo that we use with families, just breaking it down and just not rationales, but just reasons, or, you know, even in how we interpret the service plan for them, making sure that it's very family-friendly. That is one way that helps build trust. Families don't feel intimidated when they come in and we're speaking a totally different language than what they're accustomed to. We're familiar with it because we share it, and everyone else who comes into the team meeting speaks the same way. So really being at the forefront of saying, hey, let's change that language. So language in itself is something that we have worked on.
Yeah, we're all guilty of that, aren't we? Okay, a couple more hands. So over here and then in the front row.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carrie Whalen Megley. I'm from Family Ties of Westchester. We're located in Westchester County. We're a freestanding family support organization, and I want to thank you guys for the amazing work that you're doing on behalf of children and families, and also recognize your point about system of care. Westchester County was a system of care site back at the early 1996 through 2001, and really our framework and the belief in the voice and partnership of children and families was solidified and came out of that. So this is hugely powerful for me. And I think thankfully in Westchester County, we are, as I said, a freestanding family support organization and do partner with child welfare, juvenile justice, and mental health. So we are thankfully a part of programming whenever possible with our partners. And again, they're using authentic voices of kids and families in all of our processes to support better outcomes. So it's wonderful.
So Carrie, I'm not going to let you get away with just the statement.
And I'm from Cleveland too, so.
Say again?
And I'm from Cleveland originally.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
And you're also a fellow of our center at Georgetown.
Absolutely.
But how in doing that work did you manage to rebalance the differential in power and to build trust? Because I don't think you just go in and say, you know, neutral facilitators, we're really going to work with you differently. It's something that has to happen over time.
Well, and I would tell you it's a work in progress. So you never are finished. Engagement doesn't happen in segments. It's over a period of time. And really, you know, for us, and again, my background is in social work and thinking about trauma and our ACEs study and attachment. And it's really about an ongoing partnership with families. We work in the community, so families come to us. We have resource centers in different communities in Westchester County. Many of our referrals come from word of mouth, so families in the community are working with other families that are culturally and ethnically compatible with them, speak their language, understand the neighborhood, the streets that they're growing up on, the schools that their kids are involved in, and it's really about long-term relationships. Programs are wonderful. Programs, as we know, are time limited, and they get shorter and shorter, and funding comes and funding goes. But it's really, for us, about relationship and about being really embedded in a community and being available to families when they need us for as long as they need us. And then having my colleagues who are based in the communities where they live, being able to navigate systems. So it's really about long-term relationships and attachment that makes it successful. But it's an ongoing challenge constantly.
Thanks, Carrie. And we had in the front row, did we? Oh, yeah, there you are. Then I have two more hands in the back, one in the middle and one on the side.
Hi, my name is Connie Marquez. I run the Teen Accountability Program here in New York, and thank you all for this amazing and groundbreaking work. And I just wanted to speak to your point about the communication and how we interact with one another and respect one another. We run, since the 1990s, a program with teen offenders, youthful offenders, teen male offenders of violence against women. And the first, you probably may know, there's a youthful offender domestic violence court, a specialized court for in Brooklyn, and we were a founding partner with them. So we worked with defense, DA's office, court, and the presiding, and it's always the same ADA, the same judge, the same, and the presiding judge with whom we founded the program would speak to the young men every week for compliance and speak to them directly and ask them how, and congratulate them, because we'd give them compliance every week and congratulate them if they had done well. and told them that if they were compliant, she would make sure that they could come first to speak with her, and then they could leave. So, and she would have them turn around and look at the clock and say, you know, laud them or praise them for what they were doing and giving them encouraging words, and then ask them what they'd learned, and then tell them that they could leave. They wouldn't have to wait for however many hours to be called. And she was very respectful, and it was incredible how she spoke to them, because it was the only time often that they had that person of authority, I mean a judge, speaking to them specifically. And it was incredible to watch. In
a respectful, caring way, right?
And of course, I love data, so we kept all the data on.
Interesting.
But thank you.
Okay. Microphone's here, and we have two hands in the back while you're moving the mic. I just think that's such a critical point. Maybe I'm delusionally optimistic about this, but I think the more we do it, the more stories that are told by young people and families that the system really is changing the way they're engaging us, I think then you build trust that way too. But it needs to grow and accelerate. Okay, who had their hand up? Okay. Yeah,
hi,
please.
My name is Angela Tolosa. I work here in New York City in Department of Correction. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about how the Indiana system was able to communicate its change to the family member constituents. What we're doing a lot in our system is focusing on rapid sort of reform and implementation, but I'm really curious about how to kind of rebuild those trust lines, so to speak, and communicate the change and communicate the openness that led to the doubling of visitation numbers. I mean, that's extraordinary and really inspiring, and so I just want to hear a little bit more, if you could share about how that system communicated that and was able to implement that.
Sure. They started by organizing family members in a group called PIES, and I can never remember what PIES stands for, but it definitely is about parents involved, information, something like that. They provided space for family members to come together and talk with each other about concerns that they had, and they used that also as an outlet to talk about the changes that they were making, and having those members of PIES that then also partnered with them in these family orientation meetings. So when new family members were when their kid was being processed through the system, they would do a co-led orientation with a staff member and a PIES member, and the PIES member was able to communicate some of the changes that the facility had gone through, and the new practice or the new day-to-day that family members were going to be experiencing as they went through. So I really feel the PIES component, or the family council component, was key to disseminating information. They did create a new family handbook. It was okay. It's so hard, as the person in the back had described, to get out of our own jargon. Even today, when I was talking about long-term placement facilities and detention facilities, there's a chance that people in the room didn't know what that meant, and I didn't describe that or explain that to people. So I think that something that they're exploring that you're going to maybe hear about this afternoon is the use of peer advocates, so that parents are connected. And this is something that's a learning from the mental health field, where parents who had gone through a mental health crisis with a loved one become an advocate, and they get connected to a new parent who's going through this to help them navigate the system. So these peer navigators are really crucial to helping families figure out where they go, when they go there, and who they talk to, who's the friendly face, and who's the parole officer that you hope you don't get. And if you get that parole officer, who their boss is and how you can negotiate that process. Because I think it is all about relationship building. I have to second Shay's comment about that. If you can get staff to change, Margaret and I did a lot of research, organizational culture change, how do you get organizations to change? And one of the things we found was research from the airlines that said that if they wanted to improve customer satisfaction, it wasn't to actually focus on the line staff, but the relations, or what we would consider line staff, those desk agents, but how those desk agents are treated by their supervisors. And so getting that entire system to be treating each other differently, communicating differently, is going to have a big impact on the way that staff then interacts with family members. And I think that that's important to think about.
Great. Thank you. Another one over here, and I know I had a hand over here somewhere, right? Okay, no, we'll get back to you. Please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your presentation. It had a lot of good detail. I wanted to just go back to the beginning when you were speaking about your work with the Ohio Juvenile Justice Agency. I believe you made the statement that you had a lot of interaction with the staff and you referred to them as youth specialists, but you did say that formerly these were correction officers. Can you give me any detail about the transition, whatever it was, from being a corrections officer to a youth specialist? How did this happen at the Ohio Juvenile Justice Agency, please?
Sure, I can start, and Ryan will have more details to add, I'm sure. So it was part of their intentional shifting in the roles that they wanted the staff to carry out. So a lot of staff had joined the agency as juvenile corrections officers. They weren't from the adult side, but juvenile corrections officers. And I think as the agency wanted to shift to be more focused on rehabilitation and things like that and less about just safety and security, they wanted the titles of those staff to reflect that. So they changed their titles to youth specialists. Like with any organizational culture shift, it took time for all staff to really embody that change. And as an example, in some of the trainings we would do with staff, some staff would introduce themselves as youth specialist Jones. Others would say, I am JCO Jones. And so as a trainer, it was really helpful because it was pretty clear how they saw themselves in the facility. But I think it was part of the shift that they were making as an agency, and as new staff were joining, they were certainly coming in as youth specialists. They knew what that job description looked like and all of the rest. Yeah.
One quick follow-up, please. Now, when did they bring this new change on? Of no longer you're now a youth specialist, you're no longer a corrections officer. When did this start?
We started working with them in 2010, and by then I think they were already youth specialists.
And it was, to be completely transparent, part of a class action lawsuit. So they were under a consent decree with the courts to change, and this was part of their improvement plan.
Just so our technical folks know, I'm not doing any of that.
No.
So you're doing that, right? Because I have no magical powers to be flipping around that screen. So I want to fill in a little bit more about the Ohio story, but do you have more to share?
No, I was just going to speak to Robert, but go ahead, Shay.
Okay. So there is always a story behind the story, right? And this story actually is something that made it harder to do what Ohio did. So you might say, oh, a class action lawsuit, they had to be in compliance, so they forced them to do it. In the process of executing the compliance with the lawsuit, they were downsizing the use of facilities. So part of it was going from about 2,400 kids in state institutions down to today about 500. That meant they closed 2 of their facilities, maybe even 3, which meant that the way the workforce was set up in Ohio, I don't know if it was unionized or not, but the way it was set up, it was unionized. The most senior staff had the right to opt in to the positions that would be available. So it's not to say the most senior staff weren't in tune with this change. I think they may have been more of the recalcitrant group than the younger workers coming in fresh out of social work school or criminologists who were saying, yeah, this is the way we do our work now. So it made it even harder for them to get this shift in attitude, but some of those staff with more ingrained values and the culture being different were taking those positions. So they had to really work hard to shift their perspective and shift their values. Now, some of them, knowing where the agency was going, opted into vacancies in the adult correctional world or local corrections instead of staying with the Ohio Department of Youth Services. But it really required strong leadership to say that we're going to hold people accountable to do the work differently. It's not just a name change, and then built capacity to do it differently. So they went into the facility and they trained the staff in using a developmental model in working with these young people. It wasn't just saying, engage them differently, engage them more respectfully, use the JRIT. It was saying, what skills do you need to do that differently? And then we will train you to do it differently, and then we will hold you accountable in that way. So it was a long road. You can see it was about 5 years or so to really make it move in that direction. But that was the story behind the story. It was even harder than it looks on its face. Okay, where's the next hand coming from? Sir.
All right. How you doing?
You know, you are a fire hazard.
I thought about it.
But we love you being here. Okay.
All right. How you doing? My name is William Evans. I'm from the Fortune Society. Fortune Society is a reentry program where we offer wraparound services. I'm from a unit which is the ATI unit, Alternative to Incarceration. I'm a counselor in that unit, also a community liaison. So listening to some of the things that y'all were saying as far as the importance of family, I found that to be real valid because most of the participants that we work with participants that's mandated. So they may have an guardian that's really against the system, period. They don't feel as though they feel as though anybody involved with the criminal justice system is against them. So for a lot of our participants, when you have them and their mind is already shaped and built around the system being against them, they care less to share. And the parents care less about getting involved. So most of the cases, what we do is we educate the participant about what type of services we offer and whose side we're on. We let them know that we're actually in their corner. We're trying to motivate them to do better. And most of the cases, we have to have case conferences where we openly invite the parent in to be a part of that conference. And what we have seen is that most of the time when parents hear us calling them more often, parents hearing us talk to them more about what's going on, the services that we're offering, they start to jump on board. Whether it's school, whether we're calling the school, trying to find out if the participant is going to school, whether it's about them coming to the program, some of the groups that they completed and everything. So that's very important from what it is that y'all saying as far as involving the family, because if the family is not on board, the parent, the mother, the father, the brothers and sisters, if they're not on board, most of the time their ears are closed. The participant close their ears. They don't want to hear anything. They just want to come there and just avoid going back to jail. So for the information that we actually share with them and how we encourage the family to be involved, it actually opens them up to do things different when they leave the program.
It's such a good point, because I think if you can't get staff motivated to make these changes around family engagement because it intuitively or intrinsically speaks to their values, you can get them to change because it's about compliance, it's about public safety, right? So you can use that as a motivation to get staff to change too. Such a great point.
But I want to draw a distinction, if I understand correctly. You are a separate entity from probation. You are an independent organization, not part of probation, correct?
No. We work with anyone, whether they're just coming home, whether they're
But you're not an employee of the Department of Probation. Okay.
No.
So I want to make a point here that if I move this lens back and I say through the lens of a family member or child, my ideal would be that I have a team of people who work on my behalf. And they wouldn't be looking at you and saying, we trust him because we understand better what he's about, but we don't necessarily trust the system. So I think our challenge is how in engaging families and building that trust, we can say, the family member would say, this is the Fortune
Society.
And I've got my probation officer, and I've got someone from the school system, and these people are a team of people engaging me in a way that respect that I understand my child, I can support my child, but I need help in doing that. So it's not to denigrate what you do. What you do is great, but the picture needs to be more holistic, I think, in terms of how we get to a place with families that looks and feels differently. Now, I've got a hand in the back, and we're going to get to you before, and it's called Right Now.
My name is John Johnson, and I work for over 30 years in OCFS. So those facilities you referred to.
Were you released on a close-to-home program?
I'm upstate.
Okay, all right.
But my point that I wanted to bring out as far as empowering families, and over time I migrated and I was released from facility and I was transitioned into community. And I got a lot of information from families when I started to work with families. And I think that there is no quick fix. There's no document that you can create. I know there's some great documents. We worked on many as well. But until you build trust, and trust is built brick by brick. It's built relationship by relationship. And then you have to propagate the successes that you have with one family and move that to the next. Because that's how you start to change them and let them on. They always have power. They just don't exercise it. I mean, they show the power when I would talk to them in our office. but when you go to a facility, they stay quiet. So you have to start to empower them to know that what you say has value, and you do that family by family, because then those families tell the other families and say, oh, well, you know, don't worry about it. Things are different, and that's how you do it. I think there's no quick fix out there. You can try mechanisms and new surveys. I'm not denigrating surveys. I'm just saying that in addition to those, you have to understand that the way to get the system stakeholders and the families to connect is relationship by relationship.
Excellent points. Ryan or Margaret, anything to add to his comment?
No, here.
Okay. Do we have another question in the audience? Okay, we are a minute before 2:30. We're scheduled for a break at 2:30. So I'm going to move us into break, and we'll come back actually at the scheduled time, 2:45, and we'll have our panel. But please, again, join me in thanking Ryan and Margaret for their work.